do the rich teach their children about money that the poor and middle class do not? The rich have a very different way of thinking about money that anybody can learn.
My poor dad was a very good man for Japanese. He was 6'4", very smart, academic genius. But he always said to me, go to school, get good grades, get a job and work hard, save money. And my rich dad said, well, if you want to be rich, that's not the way you do it. And instead of working for money, my rich dad taught me how to have money work hard for me. And that's why I've only had a job 4 years of my entire life. Other than that, I'm building companies or I'm investing, and that's all I'm doing. My message to people is, why struggle for money when you don't have to? It's that really simple if you have good advice. The problem is money is not taught in school. And so what we do is we oftentimes follow in our parents' footsteps. We may do different jobs, but we oftentimes follow in the same financial patterns. And my rich dad used to say, he says, you can't end poverty by giving somebody money. Giving a poor person money keeps them poor longer.
Yeah.
And that's what breaks my heart, because I want to help people
change the way they think about money.
That's all it is.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most important things is that I noticed between my rich dad and my poor dad was the vocabulary. My poor dad, was a PhD in education, very smart man, but he had the vocabulary of a school teacher. And my rich dad had the vocabulary of a rich man. I sit around the dinner table and listen to both dads, and one would talk about algebra and geometry and trigonometry. Nothing of this ever made me any money. Mm-hmm. And my rich dad would sit there and he'd talk about return on investment, assets, liabilities, discounted cash flows, etc.
And a lot of people use, what you just said about your house is a liability, it's not an asset. Most people think it is their biggest investment.
Yes, and that's one of the biggest middle-class traps. They say, my banker says my house is an asset. And my rich dad would say, if you can read a financial statement, you can read that your house is actually a liability. I'm not saying don't buy a house, and I like big houses, and I like the finer things of life. Just don't call a liability an asset. And what's trapping the middle class is they're buying liabilities they think are assets.
I've always believed in living beneath the means until you could really afford to pay for stuff, mainly because I hate bills.
Right.
Just hate bills. And you say one of the mistakes that middle class and poor people do is they try to look rich.
Yes.
So those are the first people to go buy the furs, the diamonds, the big TVs, and all the stuff, correct?
Right. My rich dad called it looking good and going nowhere.
You have all this stuff. I know when I see people out and they got all the stuff and all the things, and but then when they go home, what?
They have bills.
They have bills.
And they worry and their health goes down, and it's not worth it. The thing that I think most people don't realize is that there's only two kinds of money problems, basically. One's not enough money, and one's too much money, and they're both problems. And you have to know how to handle too much money, as I'm sure you do right now. Otherwise, but it's a different problem.
Yeah, it's a different kind of problem. Yeah.
So when you have no money, you have to have a plan to eventually have plenty of money. And then when you have plenty of money, you got to shift plans.
Yes.
And so that's why people who win the lottery all of a sudden get all this plenty of money, and they go broke again.
And overwhelmed by it.
Right, and they go because they've never understood how money worked.
The educational system that I had growing up didn't teach me about debt, credit card debt, liabilities, college loans, getting that fancy car right out of school. But what Britt and Chelsea are learning now is that, hey, make your money work for you, don't work for money.
Well, one of the things you say is that the poor pay their bills first, the rich pay themselves first.
That's a really tough one, but it makes people kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Because the richest man in Babylon says pay yourself first. But what most people do is they pay the bills first and they never pay themselves anything. And that's a discipline I had to get into, was I always pay myself first, even when I had no money. And when I have all these bill collectors calling me, I use them as inspiration. You know what I mean?
Really?
Oh, when they're hounding, the government's hounding you, bill collectors calling, because I've been broke, so I can understand what it feels like to be broke. When those guys are calling you, instead of shrinking and going into the shell and eating my pizza, I use it as motivation to go out and make more money. So I use my bill collectors as motivation, and that's why I paid myself first, even though sometimes
What would you pay yourself?
I always bought assets. I'd buy a house or I'd put money in the bank and things like this, but it was just a habit. Exactly what you're talking about. It's up here. It's
about changing the way you think. That's what the whole book is about.
That's it, because we're our biggest asset, we're also our biggest liability.
One day, Fuller asked me, he says, what's your life's purpose? And I said, make money. And how did I know that was the wrong answer? he scolded me, because here I'm in rock and roll, it's sex, drugs, rock and roll. I don't do drugs, but I was trying for the rest. And he goes, it's a waste of a good mind just to make money. And I'm going, what do you mean? He says, I thought we were supposed to make money. And he just challenged my paradigm, the way I looked at world and business. He says, and I covered this in Fake, and the question he asked me, he says, why don't you do what God wants you to do? I went, what? He says, look, humanity is evolving. And you have to ask yourself, what does God want done? Not what Robert Kiyosaki wanted done. What does God want done? And he kind of scolded me in front of the whole class. I'm going, so what's wrong with rock and roll? He goes, it's about you. It's your passion, but it's not God's purpose. I'm not really religious. I'm not pumping that. So the question, I had to ask myself, what does God want done in the evolution of life? And it came to me, I don't think God wants people to be poor. And today in the world, America especially, is this gap between the rich and everybody else. And I know the game of the rich. My rich dad taught me, you know it because you're the banker. The game the bankers and the rich play is different than what they teach you in school. And that's the story of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. My poor dad, PhD, stands for poor, helpless, and desperate. They don't know anything about money. And they're teaching our kids. And my rich dad was an entrepreneur who never finished school. I grew up in Hawaii. So all of the pieces of the puzzle, when Fuller scolded me back in '83, the pieces of the puzzle and my life started to come together. And I understood what he was saying then. He says, well, maybe we should stop ripping people off. It might be a good thing. And, the question I ask all over the world, what does school teach you about money? And the answer is nothing. And that's not a mistake. That's not an accident. I knew that. Most people know that. But the way to keep the poor and middle class working hard is never teach them what the rich know. So if you read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which came out in 1997, it's what the rich teach their kids about money, the poor and middle class do not. And I had already retired. I made enough money at 47, so I didn't have to work again for the rest of my life. And I said, now what do I do with the rest of my life? And so that's when I came out with Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the cash flow game, because poverty hurts.